Okay, we're up to chapter 5 in Hilchos Teshuva, the laws of Teshuva. This chapter is very philosophical. It deals with all sorts of interesting general philosophical issues. Let's just read through number 1 again, so we'll have it on the table. Free will is granted to all men if one desires to turn himself to the path of good and be righteous. The choice is his. So we pointed out that this seems to be a 3-stage process. First of all, he turns, and when he turns, he then puts himself on the path, and then he follows the path and becomes righteous. This is not an instantaneous matter. It's not, well, you have free will, so be righteous. That's not what he's saying. And that's supports the idea that we said that sometimes the right choice is beyond you, at least temporarily. Anyway, he has free will. And should he desire to turn to the path of evil and be wicked, the choice is his. This is the intent of the statement, the Torah statement, after they eat from the tree of knowledge and God expels them from the Garden of Eden. And the way the Rambam translated is, behold, man has become unique, from himself knowing good and evil. That's the correct translation according to the way the Rambam reads it and the way Unclus reads it. So it becomes a very bold statement. Man has become unique. There's no creature other than like man who knows good and evil from himself. The knowledge is within him. He doesn't have to be taught it, explained it. It doesn't have to be revealed to him. It doesn't have to be commanded by God to him. He knows himself, good and evil. And he spells it out himself, the Rambam. I.e., that is to say, the human species became singular in the world with no other species resembling it in the following quality. That man can, on his own initiative, with his knowledge and thought, know good and evil, and do what he desires. So, this means that, as we said last time, some aspect of understanding good and evil is inherent in the human being. And we put, I would say, 2, not qualifications, but 2 background assumptions on this. Number 1, knowing good and evil for the Rambam here means knowing the principles of good and evil, the qualities that are good qualities and bad qualities. That's a general matter about your knowledge of morality. That doesn't by itself tell you what to do in a concrete case, because in a concrete case, you need to know what the facts are also. And by manipulating the facts, you can change the outcome without changing your moral values at all. So we argued that the Nazis didn't have different moral values from us. They created a fantasy that Jews are evil. If Jews really were evil and trying to take over the world and disadvantage everybody else, it would be moral to defend yourself against them. They didn't have different concepts of morality. They just created a new factual reality. And that kind of thing happens all the time. So knowledge of good and evil means these qualities are the qualities that make things good. These qualities are qualities that make things evil. And then, when you come to the real world, they have to supplement that with knowledge of how the real world works. That's one thing. And then when we say that all human beings are given this knowledge, the Rambam makes it clear elsewhere that what he means is human beings who develop normally, go through normal human childhood and upbringing and education and socialization, will develop this. It's not to say that you couldn't victimize a person to the point where he wouldn't develop it. The modern philosophers compare knowledge of morality with the knowledge of mathematics. Any normal person who grows up under normal circumstances in this world knows 7 plus 5 is 12. And he knows it not because he was taught it in the 3rd grade and he memorized it. That's not how he knows it. He thinks about it, he looks at 7, looks at 12, he sees them put together, and he says, yeah, that's 12. 7 and 5. There are children who grew up without knowledge of arithmetic. There are supposed to be societies that have no numbers. It's not inherent in the outcome. It's a capacity that human beings have, which they will develop under normal circumstances. Same thing is true with the knowledge of morality. You can have people who are brought up under such warped circumstances that certain principles of morality are just not available to them. If Dessler imagines a community of thieves living in the hills, that's because he lived in a saner time. Now you have communities of thieves living in the city, who have their own subculture, and they teach their children there's nothing wrong with stealing. The world goes to the ones who are strongest, and they never hear any dissenting view. They're just taught taking things is what you do if you're stronger. Sort of like international relations up until the 20th century. Today you have to justify yourself. But if you ask a Roman in the Roman army, why are you besieging the city? He says, because we have a stronger army. That's why. Yeah, but it's their city. Right, and we have the stronger army, so we besiege it and take it. That's what we do. That's what people do. End of story. No question there to ask. So you can have people who grow up without the knowledge of this knowledge because their socialization isn't a normal socialization. That can happen. But when the socialization is normal, when the experiences are normal experiences, this knowledge will develop. That's what the Rambam is saying. And in particular, he's saying you don't have to be told so by God in order to know that it's good or evil. Which would mean that someone who is unaware that the Creator has ever revealed himself to the creation could still know that some things are good and some things are evil. I'm skipping over some details, but anyway, that's what the Rambam says here. And then he says that's the reason why he had to be driven out of the Garden of Eden, because God didn't want him to eat from the tree of life. Now, here there's an underlying assumption, which Rambam mentions elsewhere in the guide, which is also very important. Let's see. There's a tree of life. After having eaten from the tree of knowledge, God doesn't want them to eat from the tree of life. That's a problem. How is God going to prevent them from eating from the tree of life? Well, how about just making them afraid of the tree of life? So they tremble and they don't want to approach it because they're afraid of it. How about setting up a wall? God could set up a wall that's impenetrable. Why do they kick them out of the Garden of Eden? And indeed, the way he blocks the way to go back is as if, since they have free will, if I don't do something, how about making it invisible? Then they won't eat it because they can't find it. So there's a principle underlying here that Maimonides mentions elsewhere in the guide, that God doesn't change human nature. Not that he can't, he can do anything he wants. He doesn't. He has a principle of not changing human nature. The way he set up the world, the way he wants the world to run, he wants human nature to be what it is, and people should work within that circumstance. And he brings a very interesting proof, because when they leave Egypt, and they receive the Torah at Sinai, it says, "Lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Plishtim." God didn't take them the short way into the land of Israel, via the land of the Philistines, lest they see war and be afraid and go back to Egypt. They might be frightened. So, I don't want to take them that way. I'll take them a different way. Why not just give them the courage to withstand the fight? Then they can go straight in? Nope. Kadosh Baruch Hu set up the world and created human beings with a certain basic character, certain basic dynamics, certain basic options. That's something that's essential to the way he wants the world to develop. And therefore, he uses a different strategy to get the outcome that he wants. This is a template for this kind of talk that you have over and over again. Why did Kadosh Baruch Hu do that? Because he couldn't do it any other way. What do you mean? He could do whatever he wants. But he set up priorities. Within the priorities that he set up, there was no other way out. It's not binding his power. It's explaining the intention that he has for his governance of the universe. That's what he says. He took away Pharaoh's ability to do tshuva because he wants to punish him. So let him do tshuva and punish him anyway. Because Baruch Hu could do that. He decided that tshuva should be the top rung of authority, that nothing should be able to contradict tshuva. That is to say, once you do tshuva, it's got to solve all problems. He decides the world wants to be that way. Well, if he's decided that tshuva should solve all problems, and he's decided that he wants to punish Pharaoh, then he has to, so to speak, stop Pharaoh from doing tshuva. Otherwise, he can't get the outcome that he wants, given the choices that he has made. So there's no implication here that we're limiting God's power in any way. Yeah.
With the understanding of this principle that Hashem has set things up where He wants everything to work within, human nature. He wants the Torah to be observed within human nature. How do we kind of understand that within the context of also looking at, obviously we say we don't necessarily believe we could do everything. Like, if we want to be perfect today and keep the whole Torah right now, it would probably be impossible for most of us to succeed in. So how do those two ideas work, where Torah doesn't necessarily seem like something that can be kept within the normal bounds of nature?
Okay, let's talk about this. I did speak about it last time. There are a couple of new people here, and it's important to understand. I skimmed over a certain part of this setup, so let me give you the whole picture. Let's suppose that a person is facing what seems to be an obligation, and it's impossible for him to fulfill it.
What constitutes impossible?
He isn't strong enough. He's sick in bed. He's supposed to pay money. He hasn't got any resources. They're impossibilities. So they're things that can't be done. Now, there are two ways to look at this. We certainly don't want to punish him for failure when it's impossible for him to comply. There's no evil in him. He hasn't made any bad decisions. He's not criminal in any way. It just happens to be impossible. There are two ways to say this. They may sound very similar, but they're really different. One is to say, well, if you can't do X, if X is impossible for you to do, then you're not responsible to do X. You can't have a responsibility to do something that's impossible. That's one way to say it. Immanuel Kant said it that way. Ought implies can. To say that someone ought to do something implies that he must be able to do it. Otherwise, it's incompetent to say that he ought to do it. But that's not the only option, and I think that that's not the Jewish position. The other option is to say, yes, he ought to do it. Yes, there's an obligation to do it. But when he fails to fulfill the obligation, there's no penalty because he wasn't able to fulfill the obligation. The obligation is there. He still ought to do it. But there's no penalty. We don't condemn him. We don't penalize him. We don't punish him in any way. It doesn't cost him anything because the failure to fulfill it is something which is beyond his control. Now, in the Gemara, at this point, you would ask, what's an nafkamina? What practical difference is there between saying it this way and saying it that way? And there is a practical difference. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose Reuven has borrowed money, and he had collateral, and he had income, and so on and so on, and the date of paying the money is in June, and then his house burned down, and he's fired from his job, and he got sick, and so on and so on, and in June he doesn't have the money. So according to Kant, since it's impossible to pay the money, he has no obligation to pay the money. Maybe when he recovers, he will get the obligation back, but in the meantime, he has no obligation to pay the money. According to the second position, he has an obligation to pay it, but we don't blame him, we don't fault him, we don't penalize him for not paying the money because he can't pay it. The nafkamina will be this: shall I give him the money to pay? Lend him the money to pay? Should I do that? Well, according to Kant, it's hard to see why. He has no obligation to pay. So, what am I going to do? Create the obligation for him and then have him satisfied? Why should I do that? What moral claim is there on me to provide him with the ability to pay it when he has no obligation to pay? But if you say he has an obligation to pay, it's just that he escapes punishment, negative consequences, because he's unable to fulfill the obligation, then there's a moral reason for me to provide him with the money, because in that way he can fulfill an outstanding moral obligation. Presumably the world is a better place when people fulfill their obligations than it is when they don't fulfill their obligations. And we have a rule, the Torah stresses this, the Gemara mentions it in many places, where if somebody isn't capable of doing a mitzvah, and I can give him that capacity, I have an obligation to give him that capacity. It sounds like we are not taking the Kantian side, which is no problem for us. We're not committed to Kant, and philosophy is divided on this issue.
What about
Yeah.
what about more when we say someone can or can't do something? What about more ambiguous things where it's like, for example, the obligation of to never waste time from Torah learning. Technically, there's an obligation to be learning every single moment, that you're not absolutely forced to be doing anything else. And we understand at the same time that most people today are not, learning 18 hours because they, maybe just don't have that willpower or don't whatever, So
Well,
that over there, you can't technically say they're not technically capable of it, but it's.
Well, you're
more
only
of a-
saying that because you're taking a narrow scope, but you're not taking a larger scope. There are a lot of responsibilities. There's a whole program. And it can happen that if you put your energy into fulfilling this responsibility, you'll fail at the other responsibility. And you may not be able to do all of them equally. So it still comes out that you're not able. For example, you're supposed to serve God with joy.
Yeah.
And if you're stressed out the whole time, then you may not be able to serve God with joy. I just heard from my daughter this afternoon something from Rav Zilberstein, who's one of the greatest Torah scholars of the age. And he does practical halacha. His books are they're translated to English. Most interesting questions come to him, and he gives lectures in general as well. And he said the following: there was a time when Elul was a time of tremendous fear of the judgment that's coming, and the Musar literature from 200 years ago talks about it. Everybody's shaking and so forth and so on. He said, that's not appropriate anymore, because what the shaking meant to them doesn't mean to us. And he said something almost astonishing. He said, their shaking in fear didn't contradict their joy in serving God. It didn't contradict their joy in serving God. And there's no drawing closer to God without joy. It's impossibility. Yeah, they learned this from the Hasidim. Right? So now he says, if you shake with fear, that will cancel your joy, and then you won't be successful. You'll become depressed, you'll become anxious, you'll become guilt-ridden, and you won't be successful. So we can't do it anymore. We can't do it anymore. We can't. Because we're not psychologically capable of sustaining both the fear and the joy. We've lost that capability. So there are times when your psychology just doesn't allow you to do these things. Yeah, you could be afraid, but you can't be afraid and joyful. See, here, if you're going to learn 17 hours a day, are you also going to be kind and helpful to people who need your time? Are you going to be able to daven with kavanah? Will you be exhausted the whole time? You have all these responsibilities. The mere fact that you're capable of doing this one doesn't mean you're capable of doing the appropriate service of this one and simultaneously doing all the other ones. That doesn't follow. And most of the time, people have various responsibilities at which they're not perfect, and very often it's the case that any one of them they would be able to conquer, but then the other ones would get worse. So you have to make a choice, you have to set priorities, you have to know to do it gradually. So that's now I mentioned when I said it the other day, and I'll fill that in as well since you asked, this Rambam I quoted to you about turning yourself to the path and following the path and becoming righteous implies that you can't just snap your fingers and be righteous. In Hilchos Deos, he says something even more dramatic. He says one of the 613 commandments is to improve your character. And character traits are organized on a spectrum where you have a certain type of quality, and there's too much, too little, and some intermediary amount that's appropriate. Let's say, for example, spending money. You know very well that there's a sickness where people can't spend money even on themselves. Their clothes wear out, they have nothing to eat, and they have no heating in the house. And when they die, there's $250,000 stuffed in the mattress. They can't spend it. They just can't do it. That's a horrible sickness. There's another sickness of people who just can't hold on to money. You give it to them, they get rid of it. My wife was telling me about a sad case, a woman who has serious problems. The welfare people understood, and they made her a client and everything else. At the beginning of every month, they gave her a check. What a stupid idea. Within 24 hours, it was all gone on frivolous stuff, and the rest of the month, she didn't have any food. What she needed was a daily allowance, enough money for food and necessities, and that's it. That she would do. But when she has all this extra money, she just got to Be, the largesse of having resources. So now, says the Rambam, let's suppose someone is suffering from one of the two extremes. Let's say he can't spend any money himself. He really belongs somewhere in the center where you calculate, is this expense worthwhile? What good will it do? What will it cost me? What consequences will it have? And make reasonable decisions as to what to buy and what not to buy. How do you get from the extreme of not spending a nickel to the middle? Says the Rambam, first you go from the one extreme to the other extreme in order to break the hold of the first extreme on the person psychologically. Then once that terrible habit, impulse on the first extreme is broken, then you can gradually move yourself towards the center. Which means, according to the Rambam, the way you solve an evil character trait is first to move to another evil character trait. What's happening in the meantime? In the meantime, you're in a bad situation. You go from bad to bad. And then gradually, you gravitate to the center. So that means you can't snap your fingers and go to the center. You can't do it. Psychologically, you can't do it. So I think it's quite clear that there are limitations. These two I know are explicit in the Rambam. Maybe there are more that I don't know, but these two I think are good enough to teach you that there definitely are limitations. How you know which the limitations are is a big problem. We spoke about that a little bit, about self-knowledge. But that's definitely part of the idea. So, as we said, we understand that the obligations are obligations across the board. But they are... you have no fault if you fail to fulfill the obligation because you weren't able to. I'm just thinking now, maybe there's even more to say here. Because if I can't fulfill the obligation and therefore I have no obligation to do so, what would be the moral reason for my changing my condition to be able to do so? Why would I do that? Right now, I'm not obligated to pay the money. No obligation to pay the money. You're telling me, yeah, but you should earn more so that you will be able to pay. Why should I do that? What's pushing me to do that? If I don't have any obligation to pay the money. Our picture answers that question right away. You do have an obligation to pay the money. We just won't penalize you because you can't. But of course, if you have the obligation, it's an outstanding obligation, you should do what you can to be able to pay it because you still have to pay it. I think our position is morally superior to that of Kant. Again, I'm not being mechadish or anything. I mean, the Kantian position is discussed and debated in philosophical literature. Okay, now let's go on to paragraph 2. I hope some of you have the text. I made 9 copies last time and I handed them out. I asked you to bring them. A person should not entertain the thesis held by the fools among the Gentiles and the majority of undeveloped among Israel. So this is a very widespread false thought that at the time of a man's creation, Holy One, blessed be He, decrees whether he will be righteous or wicked. God's running the world. He sets things up. He has His will for the world. And according to these people, God's governance of the world, His providence, should apply to everything. In certain things, God goes on vacation and just doesn't take care, doesn't bring things about. No, it covers everything, including whether a person will be righteous or wicked. The Rambam says this is nonsense. This is untrue. Now listen to the comparison he makes. Each person is fit to be righteous like Moses, our teacher, or wicked like Yeravim. That's pretty challenging. As righteous as Moses? Each person could be as righteous as Moses. Or wicked like Yeravim, the wicked king Yeravim. Okay, maybe to say that everybody has the capacity to be as wicked as Yeravim, still, people do have limits in evil. You think to yourself, there are certain things that are morally challenging for me, and there are certain things which I just wouldn't do. Just wouldn't do them, that's all. So what does it mean? With free will, you have the ability to do that. So there are 2 things to say here. Rabbi Yochanan of Wasserman, in an essay, says that if I, Rabbi Yochanan of Wasserman, would serve God with all my power, I wouldn't come up to Moses' ankles in performance. My service of God wouldn't compare to Moses' service of God in performance. So what does the Rambam mean here? He means that just as Moses served God with all of his capacities, so I too could serve God with all of my capacities. Of course, the outcome will be different because he gave me different capacities. But righteousness can't be measured by the outcome because the outcome is not under my control. All I can do is make the effort, what we call in Hebrew hishtadlus. Like, for example, the Ramchal in the Derech Hashem, in the way of God, says 3 times, your reward and punishment is only dependent upon your hishtadlus, upon your effort. The deep reason is because beyond that, it's not me, something that the Kodesh Baruch Hu gave me as a consequence of my efforts. I can't get reward or be punished for the consequences God gave me. I can only be rewarded and punished for what I do. So he says, I could be as righteous as Moses in using everything that I have to serve God, and then I'll sit by Moses' right hand in the world to come. I'll be equally righteous as he. This is a very deep and important idea. The Torah testifies that Moses was the humblest of all men. Did Moses have to lie to himself to be humble? Who am I? I'm just an average Joe, I'm nothing special. Does humility mean denying your greatness? Realizing you're really nothing? So first of all, we don't build our lives on lies. And certainly Moses was not equal to everybody else. And Moses had no hesitation, for example, coming down from the mountain and seeing the golden calf and telling the Levites, kill everyone who worshiped the idol. He didn't take it back to, who am I to have an opinion? Who am I to make decisions? Let other people take the leadership? No, Moses wasn't like that. So what does it mean that he was humble? Says the Moshe Chaim Lutzato in the Derech Hashem, in the Mesilas Yesharim. Humility means I'm not worthy of praise for my great qualities and accomplishments. Not worthy of praise. And Gaiva, inappropriate pride, is someone who says I am worthy of praise for my great qualities and accomplishments. Someone who thinks he's nothing is neither proud nor humble. He's not in the environment. As one adage that people use says it, God don't make junk. So if you think you're junk, you're on the wrong the wrong dimension. Just 1 second. So now it comes out that he can be humble because Moses says, yes, I have great outstanding qualities. And this person doesn't, but who knows how much of my great outstanding qualities are because of what I have done, or how much is because of what God gave me. There's a Gemara in Tanis, the Pri Tzaddik points out, Gemara in Tanis says that one great sage was in the marketplace, and he made a remark about someone whom he saw. Look how ugly this person is. And he didn't mean physically ugly, he meant his character, his behavior, his life was ugly. So now it happened that the person of whom he was speaking was Elijah the prophet, though of course he didn't know that. And the person said to him, you say I'm ugly, go to the craftsman that made me. Oh, what you see in me that's ugly, maybe that's the way God made me. Maybe it's not the result of my free choices. Are you now criticizing God who made me that way? So the Pri Tzaddik explains this. I mean, it doesn't need an explanation. He just describes it as follows. The Elijah prophet was saying to the sage, you get out of bed in the morning, what's your goal for the day? Your goal for the day is to be perfect, to do everything right. Look where you came from. Who were your parents? Who were your siblings? What schools did you go to? What great Rabbanim did you have contact with? Now me, I get out of bed and I just hope not to be terrible. That's my goal for the day. Who says your pursuit of your goal is more successful than my pursuit of my goal? You have no way of knowing that. That was Elijah the prophet's message to that sage. So this is the idea that it all depends upon the effort that you put forth. And since that's no one can know that about anybody else, Moses could be humble in that way. And on the other hand, we could equal, any one of us could equal Moses if we put in the same kind of effort that he put in. Your question.
Should the Rambam statement about Moshe and Yeravam, should that be parallel? That just as we could use all of our capacity to be righteous in the way that Moshe used all of his capacity, Yeravam would be using 100% of his capacity specifically to do the opposite?
I'm not sure. And I was going to talk about that now. I asked many people, where did the Rambam get this choice of Moses and Yeravam? How did he pick up those two? I mean, there were great people other than Moses, and there were certainly wicked people like Manasseh or Haman or other people who were terrible. So how did he particularly pick them? I asked a lot of people, and no one gave me an answer. I looked in the Frankel Rambam, he didn't ask the question. I happened to be looking for something else, and I came across a Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, which says the following. Moses, because he taught and inspired the people, the merit of the people is attributed to him, and he's protected from doing something wrong. And Yeravam, because he undermined the people and brought idol worship upon the people, then the degradation of the people is applied to him, and that's why he's the epitome of evil. Which means, according to that Mishnah, which juxtaposes Moses and Yeravam, what makes the greatness of righteousness and evil is the impact you have on others. This wouldn't apply to somebody who went off to a mountain to meditate. Moses is great because he raised up the community, raised up the whole people. Yeravam is terrible because he pulled them down. So in the depths of my great prejudices, I say this is a Hasidic idea, because that means that the greatest righteousness is what you do to raise up the community, not sitting alone and meditating and so forth and so on. All of that's fine. I don't have nothing against it, but that's not the epitome of righteousness. That could be what the Rambam is sort of hinting to here, and if so, how the Rambam's imprimatur on that idea is really very important. So he says the idea that God decrees on people before they're born whether they're going to be righteous or wicked, that is a wrong idea. Similarly, he says, he may be wise or foolish, merciful or cruel, miserly or generous, or acquire any other character traits. Now, according to the Rambam, and he's not alone in this, one of the 630 commandments is to develop good character traits. No, if it's a commandment, it means they're malleable. So you couldn't be, so to speak, predestined to be wise or foolish, merciful or cruel, miserly or generous. I think wise or foolish, these words are first of all, there's words in Hebrew, and second of all, they're very, as I say, they're very broadly applied. They can be used for how you act. That was a smart thing to do. That doesn't mean you learned quantum physics. That meant you took those circumstances into account and you weighed the priorities correctly and did that which will be effective. What's called in Hebrew, lahaskil, taskil, you'll be successful in all your ways, your actions will bear fruit. I don't think you have to talk about IQ here. It's not obvious that you can do something with your IQ, though there's a Maharsha that says so, but I'm not sure to put it into the Rambam here. There's no one who compels him, sentences him, or leads him towards either of these two paths. Leads means pushes him onto the path. Rather, he on his own initiative, decision, tends to the path he chooses. Now, the Rambam is almost always bringing his ideas from the Tanakh. He's not an independent philosopher. He's a Jewish philosopher. This was implied by Jeremiah, who said, "From the mouth of the Most High, neither evil nor good come forth." And that's a very challenging statement, and the commentators take it in different ways. Isn't God running the world? Something that happened are good, something that happened are evil. Isn't he behind them? Good crops or bad crops, plentiful rain or drought. So the Rambam takes this to mean the good and evil that people do That doesn't come forth from the Creator. The Creator does not decree that a person, by the way, it comes from the mouth. The mouth is where a decree comes from. So he takes us to be talking about a decree. Be good and refrain from being evil. Accordingly, it is the sinner himself who causes his own loss. Therefore, it is proper for a person to cry and mourn for his sins and for what he has done to his soul, the evil consequences he brought upon it. This is implied by the verse, same place, of what should a living man be aggrieved? A man of his sins. That's what he should be upset about. There's a deep implication here. If you're upset, worried, devastated, depressed by things that happen, then we have to ask, well, how do you think it happened? What's the cause of it? Where's it coming from? Is it coming from the Creator? So why are you depressed? After all, if the Creator is making it happen, it's got to be for the best. Whatever happens, it's got to be for the best. So why does it depress you? Does that mean I should never be depressed? Oh no, I could be depressed at what I do. That I could be depressed about. Teshuva, we said, has one component, which is regret. You have to regret what you did. You have to say, I wish I hadn't done it. You don't say, well, I did it, and God's running the world, so it's okay. No, that would excuse every crime. Certainly not. So the prophet says that you can be upset and aggrieved by the things that you do. And then that's appropriate. That's going to be part of the process of Teshuva. The prophet continues explaining, since free choice is in our hands and in our decisions, and our decisions is what prompts us to commit all these wrongs, it is proper for us to repent and abandon our wickedness. For this choice is presently in our hand, just as we have the ability to choose good and evil, and just as sometimes we choose evil, we also have the choice to do tshuva, and that way correct the evil, free ourselves from responsibility for the evil. So the very same thing that we cry over when it leads us in the wrong direction is the remedy for the failure. This is implied by the following verse, let us search and examine our ways and return to God. Let us do that because we have it in our power to do that. Now, again, he's saying this is implied by the verses in Jeremiah. Now he says it's in the Torah, it's in this week's parsha. Principle is a concept and pillar on which the rest of the totality of the Torah and mitzvos, as it says in Deuteronomy, behold, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil. What does that mean? I have set before you. That means they're in front of you. It's up to you to take one or take the other. I didn't impose it on you, one of them and not the other. No, I said both of them in front of you. That means it's now up to you to choose on the basis of your free choice. It also says, behold, I've set before you today the blessing and the curse, implying that the choice is in your hands. And what are the deeds which of men which a person desires to do, he may, whether good or evil. Therefore, it says, this is an astonishing statement, if only their hearts would always remain this way. From this we can infer that the Creator does not compel a decree that people should do either good or bad. Everything's left to their own. I'll give you the context for this. There was a revelation at Sinai. The people heard God speak. After they heard God speak, they said to Moses the following words, which may sound paradoxical, but I will explain them. They said, we now have experienced that God will speak with man and man will live. So, let's never do it again lest we die. So the reader thinks, hey, how does that work? What's their state of mind? We see that God can speak with man and live, so let's not do it again lest we die. Why not say, since we see that he can speak with us, we can live, so we should continue to do it, and we'll continue to live. The answer is that the experience was clearly so stressful that they felt that they just barely survived. And that being the case, they have no confidence they'll be able to survive it again. And certainly not again and again and again and again. So that being the case, they said to Moses, we want you to be the intermediary, and you should bring us the words that God wants us to know. That's what they said to God. the Torah records God's reaction. Shamati is called divrei ha'am hazeh. I've heard the words of this nation. Heitivu kol asher diberu. Everything that they spoke was good. I'm happy that they said this. Why? Mi yitein v'her levavam zeh liyiros ikol hayomim. Who would give? This is a very peculiar thing to put to have God speak. Who would give? Who could guarantee? Who could provide that their hearts should be like this forever? To have awe of me, be afraid of me, and keep my Torah. Now, putting aside the theology for the moment, God's making a wish, so to speak, that it should happen. The words say God's hoping that their hearts will be like this in the future, because if so, then they will achieve what they were created for. The world will be in a good condition. If the words say God's hoping that it will be so, that means he's not going to make it so. Otherwise, there'd be no hope. He'll simply, pound the gavel and say that's what's going to be. So that means it's up to us. It's another statement which is quite clear that it's not something that God imposes on a person. On the contrary, it's something which is under our own control. Okay, so this is typical. This is where the Rambam's philosophy comes from. It comes from the book of Jeremiah. It comes from Eicha. It comes from the Chumash. That's where his philosophy comes from. It's not an Aristotelian, in case they're still teaching that nonsense. So, now he wants to explain the philosophical consequences of making the mistake that almost everybody makes, thinking that God does decree. And here we have, I would say, the moral purpose of free will, the moral application of free will, why free will is important for morality in general. This is paragraph 4. Were God to decree that an individual will be righteous or wicked, or that there would be a quality which draws a person by his essential nature to any particular path of behavior, way of thinking, attributes, or deeds, as imagined by many of the fools who believe in astrology, how could he command us through the words of the prophets, do this, don't do that, improve your behavior, do not follow after your wickedness? What would be the point of talking if the thing was already decreed? It's sort of like talking to your computer. Come on, don't use those short sentences. It's programmed to use short sentences because it thinks you're 6 years old, so it uses short sentences. It's not listening. It can't do anything. It can't do any differently. When you give a command to something, you expect the command to make a difference. For the command to make a difference, it can't be prefixed what it's going to do. So the very fact that God issues commands implies that we have free will. Here you have vast literature in the 1,000 pages of Tanakh. Over and over again, God issues commands. The philosophical implication of issuing the commands is that we must have free will. Otherwise, the commands would be empty. That's one of the proofs of the moral necessity of free will. He says, if you thought it was decreed, then from the beginning of man's creation, it would be decreed upon him, or his nature would draw him to a particular quality, and he could not depart from it. What place would there be for the entire Torah? According to which judgment or sense of justice would punishment be administered to the wicked or reward to the righteous? Shall the whole world's judge not act justly? This is a second moral requirement. What does it mean to punish? And by the way, notice the Rambam puts punishment first and reward afterwards. I'll explain that in a minute. Because in punishment, the point is, how shall I say, crystal clear. And in the case of reward, you need a little fetch to understand it. Imagine that someone makes a rule, and he says, if you violate this rule, then I'm going to punish you. And someone violates the rule because he was programmed to do so. Would it be just to punish him for violating the rule? 19 minutes ago, we talked about that, and we said, if you have an obligation and you're incapable of fulfilling it, it's completely wrong to penalize the person in any way. That's not justice. You don't penalize for people for doing something where they had no alternative. There was nothing else they could do. So if God both decreed for people what they're going to do and also punish them for failing to live up to his rules, then God's governance of the world would be unjust. And we don't associate injustice with God at all. That's from the side of punishment. The side of reward, it's a little more tricky. What do you want to say? Well, reward means you worked for it, you earned it, and you deserve it. So if you couldn't work because you were programmed to behave in one way or another, it was programmed that you would do the things that fulfill the rules, then there's something wrong with giving reward for that? Well, it's not going to be unjust. Why can't God just give a free gift? That's not unjust. But it's not reward. Reward by definition is something that you earned, something you're owed, something that's because of the actions that you performed. If you're a program, if you're a machine, you don't give rewards to your computer when it computes nicely and gives you a result. Right? It hasn't earned anything because it's only a machine. So here it's not moral injustice if you gave something to someone who did the right things when he was programmed, but you couldn't call it reward. So the problem here is a little more subtle philosophically. But in both cases, reward and punishment in a programmed world don't make sense. Yeah.
So I find it interesting. Rabbi is quoting the Rambam's words. He keeps saying how we can't possibly say a person is drawn to one way and can't do differently. You know, that's two things he made. That's two points with that. You know, he's saying that can't be, that a person is drawn towards one way and that he can't do differently. Well, okay, that he can't do differently, I understand, but that he's drawn towards one way, don't we in fact believe that people are born with?
You didn't say it right. You didn't say it right. There are two different ways in which it could be engineered that he can't do differently. And in both ways, he can't do differently. One is simply the decree. Here's the program of actions. On Tuesday, you'll do this. On Friday, you'll do that. Next year, you'll do that. That's one way. That's the decree. And the other way is to create a certain aspect in his character, certain psychological aspect of him, which dictates how he will do it without the detailed practice actions being decreed, but the aspect of uncontrollable, like a crack addict who can't help stealing. He just can't help it. Right? It's not decreed that he shall steal. It just makes him a crack addict, and then he steals. That's the two ways to engineer that it be unavoidable to do what he's doing. Both cases, it's unavoidable. It's not in one case yes, in one case no. Yeah, we're together.
But we do believe in, people having inclinations towards.
Yes, of course. In fact, the Rambam himself says elsewhere that people are born with inclinations. He's a little more subtle than that. People are born in such a way that their experiences develop in them certain inclinations. So that by the time they become adults, 13 for a boy, 12 for a girl, they already now have certain inclinations, and their job is to deal with those inclinations. People have different inclinations, different resources. Their job is to develop their character, develop their actions as they can. So inclinations, of course you have. The human psychology tells you that. But it's not programmed, yeah.
Can you get rid of those inclinations, or is it something that you have to learn how to manage?
So it's a very interesting question. I think psychologically it's not 100% clear. We all know that you can increase and decrease the strength of various inclinations that you have. You can do that by controlling your environment, because you know certain things, as they now say, trigger you, or push your buttons. You want to use the jargon that's popular today. Then if you arrange a different environment for yourself, then you won't be triggered in those ways, and then your behavior will be different, and your psychological experience will be different. Whether you can actually rid yourself of a quality, or I'm also puzzled whether you can create for yourself a quality that is entirely absent. I'm not convinced that that's possible. I'm not convinced it's impossible. I'm not convinced it's possible. There's got to be something in there that already has it, at least nascent, and then you could develop it and grow it out of that. A psychopath for whom other people's pain is like color blindness. It's just not there. It's just not there. Take color blindness, but see the red. Work on yourself. Look more closely, Get up in the middle of the night and turn the flashlight on, and then maybe you'll see the red. No, if the rods and cones aren't working, it's just not going to get it. It's not going to be there. So if a psychopath is like that, if he really doesn't have the dimension of responding to other people's pain, I don't know what you could do to give him that dimension. You could grow it out of something that's already in him. I don't see how that's possible, but I'm not a psychologist, so I'm confessing ignorance to answer your question. But our lives are based on strengthening and weakening, and that we certainly can do, and we know there are techniques for doing that, and that's our responsibility to do whatever we can. And there's a variety of ways of doing it. We'll talk about that in Yisrael. Okay, we'll pick it up tomorrow in Yisrael.